Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Makki, who joins us from Florida. Amanda, a pleasure to have you with us as always.
Thank you.
And we're also joined by David Kusnet, former speechwriter to President Bill Clinton. David, great to have you with us again as well.
Good to be with you.
Thank you both. Let me start with you, Amanda. A 37-year-old woman was fatally shot by a U.S. immigration agent on Wednesday. What's your understanding of what happened?
Well, I've watched the video, and if you watch it in slow motion, she certainly had the opportunity to stop, get out of the car, and comply with federal law enforcement. She chose not to do that, and there were repercussions, and unfortunately, it was fatal. I think the fact that you have someone who's willing to give her life for illegal activity, for illegals, criminals, when she's a mother of 3 children, really tells you that people's priorities are not aligned. They should be focused on what their, responsibilities are instead of working against federal law enforcement, which is what she did. And unfortunately, she's now dead. So law enforcement is going to do its job. She could have easily run over the officer that was in front of her. And that's in essence what I saw on the video.
Okay, David, does that tally with your understanding of how events unfolded?
I saw it a little differently. As I saw it, she was swerving the vehicle away from the officer, and the last shot was fired at her when she was moving away from the officer. I'm not sure it's a good idea if you're stopped by a police officer from any level of government to get out of the car. I don't think people are advised to do that. Trying to find the bigger picture in this, I remember that President Clinton used to say, we're a nation of immigrants and we're a nation of laws. We need to enforce our immigration laws, and we also need to enforce them in a lawful way. I think that what happened yesterday was a terrible tragedy. I would not blame the woman who was killed. And we need to have some accountability for what happened. We need to have some oversight over what is going on. And we need to have some effort by every level of government and public officials from both parties to find some way that we can enforce the law in a way that respects the law.
And David, do you think ICE has got a culture issue in terms of how it operates? Do you think they've got the wrong approach? Do you think they're too heavy-handed? Do you think they need to have a bit of a rethink?
I think we need to have some oversight to find out what their culture is. There's been quite an expansion of their role, quite an expansion of the number of agents. We need to find out how they've been trained, what instructions they've been given, and there needs to be some oversight. And when I'm talking about congressional oversight, I'm talking about a Congress that is run by the Republicans, but that does have Democrats, and you need to have members of both parties conducting some oversight over what is going on and what is being done in the name of the American people. There's certainly cause for concern. I think what happened yesterday is a terrible tragedy, and it's cause for concern, and it calls for some accountability and some oversight.
Amanda, your response, cause for concern, needs some oversight. How would you respond to that?
Well, I just want to take this back and say I certainly would not drive off if law enforcement was pursuing me or trying to talk to me. I mean, that's not what you do. So in that event, what happened was she was basically trying to get away from police officers who were trying to stop her. And this really goes back to really progressive leaders in this country telling people to defy law enforcement. That is never a good thing. So when you have the mayor of Minneapolis come out and say, F these people and, get the F out of our state, you're not setting the right example no matter what. Tom Manger, who is a police chief, was for many years in the surrounding areas of Washington, D.C., was on MS Now, certainly a liberal channel. And he was saying, this is not what you do. She should not have done that. And so I understand, and believe me, as she is a mother of three, I can't comprehend how tragic this is for her and her family. But in that moment, we have to understand why she was driving off, knowing that there are multiple federal law enforcement agents there. So I want to get into the minds of what people are thinking when they're doing these things. I wouldn't do that. I don't think you would do that. But the fact that they're doing this, I think, has a lot to do with what progressive leaders in this country are telling people to do. And they shouldn't be. And that's wrong. So I think it's really important to take it back to who the leadership is in this country and why they're telling people to not abide by federal law enforcement.
Right. I mean, just to pick up on what you're saying there, Amanda, so Minneapolis officials telling ICE to get out of the city and get out of the state altogether. I mean, do you think they will?
No, I don't. And in fact, I think President Trump is now even more inclined to send federal law enforcement, Department of Homeland Security. Scott Besson of the U.S. Treasury Department has said that his folks will be there because there is rampant fraud in that state. Now, this is different than what's happening there, but if you have smoke, you have fire. And so this administration wants to make sure that whatever is happening where money's being funneled from American taxpayers that's supposed to go to American indigent children and families, but instead is being funneled to al-Shabaab in Somalia, that we get to the bottom of this. And so there is, in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with wanting to do the due diligence that the state of Minnesota clearly has not been doing. Our tax dollars have been funneled to terrorist organizations, and we need to get to the bottom of this. There is a federal nexus. There's a federal nexus with immigration. There's a federal nexus with the U.S. Treasury. And again, I say this on your show a lot. I say it when I'm on TV a lot. This is what people voted for. They voted for tougher on crime, get the illegals out. That is something that President Trump campaigned on. This is not a shock or surprise to anyone. But that said, President Trump did say, we're going to be focused on criminals.
Sure, David. Okay, jump in, David.
That's fine.
To back up for a minute, I'm not sure if I'm hearing the other panelist saying that Nicole Good was trying to run over the ICE agent or that she was trying to escape from him. I'm not sure how you could be doing both in real time and at the same moment at a time when her adrenaline must have been flowing. I also worked for an earlier generation of Minnesota political leaders. I worked for Walter Mondale, showing my age, I worked for Walter Mondale in 1984. I think there's a great tradition of decency among Minnesota progressives. Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, Walter Mondale, Amy Klobuchar. And these are people who respect the rule of law and who also believe that the rule of law has to respect regular people, including the most vulnerable people. There's Americans all over the country, not only in Minnesota, who want to watch what ICE is doing. They don't think people in masks, law enforcement officers in masks should be functioning in the darkness. And they go out and watch what ICE is doing. They're not doing that because Tim Walz told them to do it or because Amy Klobuchar told them to do it. They're doing it because their conscience calls upon them to do it. And it's not without risks, as we saw yesterday. And I don't think that whatever Nicole Good woke up in the morning yesterday to do, she expected to be doing any harm to a federal officer, or she expected that it would cost her her life. And I don't think any reasonable person, and I would include the other panelists, I don't think any reasonable person believes that she deserved to die, and yet she did. And we need some accountability. We need some oversight over what happened. And I don't think that anyone needs to be afraid that this will be loaded against ICE or loaded against the administration, because as President Trump would say, they're holding most of the cards. But you do need some accountability and some oversight in a situation where people, where public officials and investigators who are not inclined to take to take ICE's word unchallenged, where they get a chance to ask some questions and look at the video. I don't know if you want to look at it in slow motion. I don't know if you want to play it backwards. I know if you look at it as it was shown on networks last night, it is very concerning, and we need some oversight and we need some accountability.
Amanda, how do you respond to that?
Well, look, the evidence is all going to come out. That's clear. But I think if you watch the video in slow motion, and I've actually read a lot this morning on people that are of the liberal mindset, the conservative mindset, why did she want to flee? When you're trying to be detained and you flee, you expect that there could be repercussions. And again, I'll go back to my first statement. This is a mother of three. She wants to harbor illegals instead of focusing on, wait a second, if something happens to me, I won't be there for my children. That mentality is what is really scary to me, that someone would be willing to, and I'm in agreement with you. I don't think she thought she was going to lose her life, but something terrible could have happened knowing that she was escaping from federal law enforcement. And I think this comes back to what I said, where you have leadership in the Democratic Party pushing this message, pushing where you don't have to, you can resist. You don't have to stand there and talk to an agent. You can say this or you can leave. That is not the case. And this is unfortunately the reality of what's happened. So look, no one wants to see anything like this, but the reality is this is happening. And Minnesota is ground zero right now. And anyone in Minnesota, the governor has said he's bringing out the National Guard. I do think that things are going to escalate because of what happened. But as far as investigating and oversight, 100% we want to see that. But also, if you've seen the slow motion video, a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans, seem to agree. Why did she walk away? To include police chiefs who are not necessarily conservatives.
Okay, well, she's been labeled a domestic terrorist who weaponized her vehicle. David, what do you make of that kind of language?
I'm trying to figure out, I don't know if you're watching it slow motion, you're playing it backwards, you're watching it as it was shown over the networks. But I'm having trouble, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'm having trouble figuring out how she could simultaneously have been running away and trying to run the agent over. It seems like the two don't go together.
Well, if there was an agent in front of her
I think she's somebody
trying to drive off, then she is putting his life in danger.
And to the point about being parents of young children, if you look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the 1950s, or the Montgomery bus boycott, 1960s, there were a lot of people who were parents of young children. Martin Luther King was the father of young children who went out and fulfilled their obligations as they saw them as citizens and bore witness and witnessed what was going on. I don't think that the other panelist wants to say that the parents of young children cannot observe and protest injustice. I don't think she's anti-family. I'm sure that as we all are, she's pro-family.
They're trying to detain her and she's driving off. This is not a peaceful protest. I don't see that as a comparison. I believe, and, we can talk about this more broadly. Iran right now, you see people are taking to the streets and demonstrating, knowing their lives could be in danger. But what she did is she drove off, and she did put another law enforcement agent's life in danger because he was in front of her. That is just not something a reasonable person would do. They would stay there and they would, provide whatever identification or whatever it might be. That's what I would do. I would think that that's what you would do, but she didn't. And unfortunately, we now have a fatality.
Do you think she's a domestic terrorist, Amanda?
I don't know her background. I don't know anything about her, but if someone is unlawfully doing something to harbor someone who's illegal, then she can be labeled things based on her actions, based on what she's done. And again, I don't know exactly what happened. Until I know, I don't want to label anyone, especially someone who's deceased. But I would say that whatever she was doing, it doesn't seem like she was doing something that was lawful.
David, in terms of what the reaction has been in the United States, where do you see things heading to? Could this become a massive national flashpoint of the kind we've actually seen in the past?
Well, it could become that, and it shouldn't become that. I just want to reiterate the point that the way to prevent a tragedy like this from becoming a flashpoint is to have accountability, have oversight, have hearings, have an investigation where where the American people get to learn what was going on, and we get to learn whether the agency and whether the officer behaved properly. And I think I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's a foundational principle in this country that law enforcement has to respect the law and has to respect the citizens. And we need to find out if that in fact was going on. And if, as was said earlier, whether the internal culture of an ICE, which has been very much expanded in terms of its mission and in terms of its staffing, whether they have an internal culture that is conducive not only to enforcing the law, but to respecting the law and to respecting the rights of their fellow human beings.
Amanda, how effective do you think the combined Trump administration efforts and those efforts of ICE have been in terms of curbing illegal immigration in the US these last, 11 months?
Well, I think if you look at the statistics, we don't have border crossings anymore. We were in the tens of thousands in the Biden administration, and that's what people voted for. And I think people have to remember that. Like him or hate him, that's what people wanted. And people crossed over, even Hispanics. He won by wide margins with Hispanics who don't want to see their communities plagued with crime, overridden with people who are coming here illegally, taking their jobs, all of these things that Americans want the safety and security of. Now, I am an immigrant to this country myself. My family and I, we sought political asylum. We came here the legal way, grew up in the DC area. My father practiced medicine for almost 15 years before he became a US citizen. That's the legal process. That's not what was happening under the Biden administration. And the American people were fed up with it, including immigrants like myself. And so I think it's really important that we look at the stats, we look at what the numbers are today, and we look at things like Laken Riley, for example, someone who was gunned down by a Venezuelan who had committed crimes before. This is something we hear a lot in communities throughout America, and Americans don't want to see that anymore. So President Trump is doing exactly what he campaigned on. And again, like him or hate him, this is what the people wanted, and that's what we voted for. We voted for this.
David, how do you respond to that? This is what the American people
I don't
voted
think
for.
anyone voted for what we saw last night. And I think that the consensus position...
Of course no one voted for someone to be shot down. We're not even talking about someone who's an American. We're talking about illegals.
Let's let David make his point.
And I think the consensus position is what President Clinton, and I wouldn't be surprised if the President Bush has also said this, and President Obama. I think the consensus position is that we're a nation of immigrants, as the other panelists, I think, eloquently said. We're a nation of laws, and we're a nation where we enforce our laws, but we do it in a way that respects the law and that respects the rights of human beings. And we need to, again, I just have to repeat, we need to have an oversight process and a process of accountability and some effort to reach across party lines and not see this as a wedge issue. And clearly, if it's going to be used as a wedge issue, it's going to benefit the Republican Party and not the Democratic Party. So the Democrats have no interest in making this a wedge issue. We need to make this in some way a bridge issue where we find a way that we can defend our borders, welcome legal immigrants, respect the rights of human beings who are here, because people have inherent rights as human beings, not only as citizens, but as human beings, and find some way to move forward from what we saw last night.
Okay, and just as we sort of bring this conversation to a conclusion, I mean, what messages do these tactics by ICE send out, not just domestically, but to the wider world? Amanda?
Well, I do agree in that, the messaging is really important. And I want to say that, we have a judicial branch that is separate and apart from politics. They are, of course, appointed by presidents, but that's the whole point of the judiciary system, is that, of course, this is going to be brought before the court and there could be hearings in Congress. And so, I feel very confident that, all of this will be laid to rest when this does go to the judicial body. That said, I think that we have to look at the leadership once again in the Democratic Party. They have tried to thwart the president and the president's orders at every step. I don't remember Republicans ever saying, don't do what Joe Biden is saying. Don't do what Joe Biden is trying to achieve to keep safety or security or to secure the border. I don't remember Republicans doing that for President Obama. So why is it that for President Trump, you have all these Democratic leaders, elected leaders, saying, don't listen to him? He's the president of the United States. You may be the mayor, you may be a state official, but your job is to not tell people to disregard the law, disrespect the law, and not abide by the law. I think that is really the problem. And so the Democrats on messaging need to, understand that they can't just be telling people not to abide by the law. The president is going to set policies and do what he thinks is in the best interest of keeping the homeland safe.
All right, Amanda, you had the first word. I'm going to give the last word to David. David, please feel free to comment on that. And also, I'd like to get your comment. Just also wanted to get your comment on.
A few days after.
I want to get your comment on what message you think all of this sends out to the rest of the world.
January 6th. We're only a few days after January 6th. And I remember Republicans saying that Joe Biden wasn't even legitimately elected president. I remember people storming the Capitol to try to overturn an election. I remember somebody who later became president saying that Barack Obama wasn't a legitimate president because he questioned his birth certificate and questioned whether he was whether he was eligible to be president of the United States of America. So Americans are not required to obey the president. Americans are required to accept the results of an election and to recognize the fact that the president is president, and you can disobey him, you can disagree with him, but you should not try to overturn his election by force and violence and stopping and storming the Capitol. And you should not question the citizenship of the president of the United States.
Fair enough. And can I just ask you to answer that one question about what you think these tactics by ICE send out to the rest of the world by way of a message, David?
Well, I think there's a human tendency, whether, as the other panelists said, in Iran, and I think we joined together in supporting the protests in Iran, whether it's what happened in Tiananmen Square in China, whether it's what happens in Venezuela. I think there's a human tendency to at least find some sympathy with an unarmed person who is challenging an armed and masked officer. Sometimes the armed officer, if not the masked officer, may be in the right. But I think there's a human tendency, it's certainly an American tendency, to side with the person who seems to be on the receiving end of violence. Well, but not to side, at least to have some human sympathy and want to hear what the story is.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but really appreciate you both taking the time to speak to us. David Kusnet, former speechwriter, President Bill Clinton, you had the last word. Thank you to you. And thank you as well to Amanda Makki, regular on the show and Republican strategist and lawyer. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.